Dean squinted through the thick snowflakes that were falling steadily against the windshield of the Impala. The high beams were doing nothing to make visibility any easier, and Dean knew that there was no way he was going to be able to make it back to Kansas from Vermont if it kept snowing like this. "We should pull over." Cass's deep voice cut through the sound of the windshield wipers that were trying their best to clear the glass before Dean's eyes. "I know," Dean replied. "There was a sign for a motel just a mile back." "I think it's this turn coming up," Cass said. Dean nodded. "I think you're right." "Should we call Sam?" Cass asked. "Once we're checked in, yes." Sam had stayed at the bunker to clean it up before Christmas, which Dean now saw they wouldn't be home for, and to work a local case that Dean was pretty sure was just a vampire that Sam could handle without him. Dean and Cas had headed to Vermont to check out what had seemed like a Wendigo but had turned into 7 werewolves. Dean pulled up to a small motel and parked the Impala in the only available spot. The doors squeaked as he swung out of the driver's seat, and snow crunched under his feet as he headed towards the front office with Cas right behind him. When they entered the office, they saw that there was one woman sitting behind a register. She had mousy brown hair and brown eyes. She looked up as they came into view. "Oh my!" she exclaimed. "Were you two out there in this blizzard?" "Unfortunately," Dean replied. "Well, I'm glad you made it off the road all right." "We'd like a room with 2 queens, please," Dean said. The woman blushed slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry, but we only have 1 room available, and it's 1 queen." Dean didn't have time to reply because Cas flashed her a smile and extended his hand for the key. "That's okay. We'll make do." Dean put a hand on Cass's shoulder. "Cas." Cas shook him off. "It's okay, Dean." Cas handed over a credit card and then took the key from the woman. "Have a good night," she said. Cas smiled. "You as well." They headed back out into the blizzard, and Cas opened the trunk of the Impala. "You can take the room, Cas. I'll just sleep in baby tonight." "Don't be ridiculous, Dean," Cas said as he took out Dean's duffel from the trunk. "It's -20 degrees out. You'd freeze out here." Slightly annoyed, Dean was forced to follow Cas back into their room. The angel deposited Dean's duffel on the table and then surveyed the room. There was 1 bed, as promised, a round table with 2 chairs, and a door leading to the bathroom. There wasn't even a couch, which Dean had been hoping he could crash on. Cas didn't seem bothered by the layout of the room as he sat down on the bed. "Look, Cas, are you sure about this? I can sleep on the floor if you want the bed." Cas's blue eyes pierced Dean's as he untied his shoe. "Why? There's enough space in this bed for both of us." Dean resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "I just didn't want to make you uncomfortable." The angel's voice was sincere as he replied. "You don't make me uncomfortable, Dean." He paused, as if afraid to say something else. He said it anyway. "Do I make you uncomfortable?" Dean was quick to shut down Cas's suggestion. "No, of course not, Cas." Cas pulled off his other shoe. "Then there's nothing to worry about. I'm going to take a shower." "Okay." Once Cas disappeared into the bathroom, Dean collapsed into a chair. The idea of sharing a bed with Cas made Dean feel 2 very conflicting feelings. He'd never slept in the same bed as another man before, unless you counted Sammy when he was younger and they had to share a bed on hunts, so he felt a little awkward about getting cozy with Cas. At the same time, there was this other feeling that Dean was trying his best to ignore. Excitement. Why was he excited to sleep in the same bed with Castiel? There was no reason whatsoever for Dean to be excited to share a bed with the angel. Dean didn't know where his thought process was going to lead him, so he quickly pushed his thoughts and feelings away, which was something Dean had become very good at. Remembering he needed to call his little brother, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Sam's number. "Dean." Sam's voice came over his speaker with a crackle. "Hey, Sammy," Dean replied. "Look, I don't think we're going to make it back in time. We've hit a big storm and we're stranded at a motel. I don't know when it's going to lift, but I'm not thinking it'll be anytime soon." "Well, I'm glad you're all right. Just keep me updated." Sam's voice was harder to understand now, and Dean knew the storm was interfering with his call. "We're breaking up, Sam. I'm gonna hang up now." Dean hung up, and a few moments later Cas emerged from the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist. "Do you need to shower too?" he asked. "Suppose I should," Dean replied. It was still strange to Dean how human Cas was becoming. Not just because he was just that, human, but because it was hard to wrap his head around the fact that the all-powerful angel he had first met was gone and replaced by this new version of Castiel, that Dean was too ashamed to admit he kind of liked. Dean stepped into the still steaming bathroom and turned on the shower. Stripping quickly, he moved under the warm stream of water and let it wash away the dirt and blood from the case they had worked merely hours ago. Once Dean was done, he put on a fresh pair of boxers and came out of the bathroom to find Cas already sitting on what he had claimed as his side of the bed, which was the left. Dean was still toweling off his hair as he sat down on the edge of his bed and tried to ignore the fact that Cas was also shirtless and probably only wearing boxers, as neither of them had brought actual pajamas with them. Dean pulled back his side of the covers and slid into bed. Without a word, Dean reached for the light on his side of the bed, and as the click of the switch echoed around the room, Dean heard a deep voice very close to his ear say, "Good night, Dean." Dean felt a shiver of warmth rise up his spine as he fell against his pillow. "Good night, Cas." Dean woke to find Cas's arm spread across his chest. The angel was still asleep, and Dean wasn't sure whether he should try and get up without waking Cas or just wait until he woke up. Dean couldn't ignore the fact that Cas's arm was giving off a comforting warmth that Dean hadn't felt in a long time. Something about this situation made Dean feel safe, which he never felt, and he didn't want it to end. Dean glanced at the window of the motel room to see that snow was still falling thickly and steadily. He knew they weren't going to be able to drive back home today, so Dean decided to just enjoy the temporary vacation and let Cas sleep. Dean was just dozing off again when Cas stirred and the warmth from the angel's arm was suddenly gone. Dean opened his eyes to see Cas staring at him anxiously. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." Dean yawned. "You didn't. I've been awake for a little while." Cas's expression was unreadable. "Oh. Why didn't you wake me then?" Dean laughed as he sat up. "Well, you seemed comfortable. I didn't want to disturb you." "Oh," was all Cas said again. But Dean thought he saw something rise up on the angel's face that he had never seen before. Was he blushing? "Should we go see if there's anything for breakfast?" Dean asked as he pulled on a fresh pair of boxers he had taken from his duffel. "Yeah, we probably should," Cas replied as he too began putting his clothes on. Once dressed, they both headed out into the blizzard towards the small cafe that the motel had. They entered the warm little building and dusted off their coats and hair from the snow. The little cafe was packed with people, which wasn't surprising as the motel was at full capacity. The young man behind the counter called out to them. "Can I help you two?" Dean stepped up and after a quick survey of the menu said, "I'll have a coffee, black, and the special for the day." The man nodded. "And for you?" he asked Cas. "I'll just have the same thing," Cas answered. "That's an even 20, the man said. "Perfect." Dean handed the man the 20 and led Cas to a small table by the window. "How did you sleep?" Cas asked, trying to make conversation. "Pretty well, actually. You?" "Pretty well," Cas replied, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. Cas kept talking. "So, what are we going to do today?" Dean pondered that for a moment. "I don't know. Watch TV?" Before their conversation could go further, their food arrived. The special was set in front of both Dean and Cas, which was 4 waffles piled with strawberries, whipped cream, syrup, and bacon on the side. "This looks amazing," Cas said as he picked up his fork. "It does, doesn't it?" Dean grinned. Cas shoved a large forkful of waffle and whipped cream into his mouth, and his eyes closed in enjoyment. "I will never get used to this whole eating thing. It's really quite marvelous." Dean smiled over his own mouthful of waffle and toppings. Once they finished eating, they headed back to their room, and Dean collapsed on the bed. Cas fell down next to him, and Dean reached for the TV remote. He turned on the TV to see an episode of Scooby-Doo playing. Cas watched with interest, and Dean let his head fall back against the headboard of the bed. They sat like that for hours, close but never touching, eyes glued to episode after episode of Scooby-Doo. Finally, Dean turned off the TV and stretched. "I'm gonna go clean off Baby. If the snow keeps falling like this, it'll leave a dent in her roof." Cas stood up. "I can help if you'd like." Dean shrugged. "Sure, if you want." Together they went out into the storm, and Dean opened the trunk to get out the scraper. Cas picked up gloves from the bottom of the trunk and handed them to Dean. "You should put these on." Dean took the gloves without complaint before tossing Cas his own pair. "So should you." Cas began to swipe sections of snow from the hood of the car as Dean worked on the roof. A mischievous idea popped into Dean's head as he pushed a large clump of snow to the ground. Quickly, Dean shoved a pile of snow towards the windshield, which Cas was busy cleaning, and watched as it landed on top of his head. Cas gave a yelp of surprise as Dean howled with laughter. Cas's snow-covered head poked through the pile of snow. "Not funny, Dean." Cas's voice was deep with annoyance, but his eyes were glinting with laughter. Dean smirked. "It was a little funny." Before Dean saw it coming, Cas had grabbed a wad of snow from the front of the car and hauled it at Dean. It hit him square in the face, and sent him stumbling back in surprise. "Now that was funny," Cas laughed as Dean wiped his face. "Oh, that's it, it's on," Dean yelled as he scooped snow from the ground and threw his own snowball at Cas. The angel was too slow, and it hit him in the chest. Cas lobbed his own snowball back at Dean, which Dean dodged by slipping behind the trunk of the Impala. They circled each other, using Baby as a shield and occasionally tossing unaimed snowballs in each other's general direction. This went on for what seemed like hours until Dean finally landed a particularly good hit on Cas's face. Cas held up his hands. Okay, you win." Dean's head popped up from beside the passenger side of the Impala. "Giving up so easily?" Cas laughed as he shook snow from his hair. "You're too good. I've barely gotten one hit on you." Dean grinned as he came over to Cas's side of the car. "Well, in fairness, this wasn't my first snowball fight. Now what do you say we finish cleaning off Baby, then go inside and get some hot chocolate?" "Sounds good," Cas replied. It took them a half hour before Baby was free of white powder. As the snow was still falling, Dean knew that it would only pile up again, but at least his baby was visible to the world. Freezing and numb, Cas and Dean headed to the little cafe to get warmed up. Dean ordered them both large cups of hot chocolate before sitting down at the same table they'd had breakfast at. "Do you want some lunch too, or are you okay?" Dean asked. "Maybe later. I'm still full from those waffles," Cas replied. "Me too," Dean agreed. Their hot chocolates arrived and Dean took a sip of the steaming liquid. "Is it good?" Cas asked. Dean replied as he shut his eyes and let the feeling return to his fingers. They took their time with their hot chocolate, and when they finally finished, Cas stood up with a stretch. "I don't know about you, but I could use a nap." Nap? Dean had never really had time to take a proper nap in his entire life. I mean, sure, he'd napped plenty of times, but never because he just wanted to. It was usually because he'd spent the whole night staking out a monster of some sort. The idea of actually getting more than 4 hours of sleep in a day seemed ludicrous to Dean, and he'd never attempted to try it. Dean suddenly realized that this was another excuse to share the bed with Cas again. It also made Dean sick when it hit him that he actually liked the idea of taking a nap with Cas. "Sure," was all Dean said, as he placed his empty cup in the trash and followed Cas back out into the storm. Their motel room was warm when they stepped back inside. Dean watched Cas slip out of his trench coat and toss his shoes by his side of the bed before climbing under the covers. Dean took off his coat and shoes as well and followed Cas into the bed. He could feel his red cheeks defrosting as the warmth of Cas's body took over his chilled limbs. Cas was asleep in moments, his mouth slightly open and his breathing slow and deep. Dean found himself watching Cas, his eyes traveling over the angel's features, lingering on the curve of his mouth and his defined jawline. Dean forced himself to look away, to ignore the strange feeling that was spreading through him at the sight of Castiel. Dean shut his eyes, and just as he did so, he felt pressure on his left side as Cas rolled into him. Dean froze as Cas's arm snaked across his chest and his face buried itself in Dean's shoulder. Every feeling Dean had been suppressing since he met the angel seemed to pour through him at that moment. Without thinking, Dean shifted ever so slightly so that he could put his own arm around Cas and rest his chin on top of the angel's head. Cas moved into his motions, and soon they were wrapped around each other, Cas nearly all the way on top of Dean's chest, and Dean's left arm protectively hugging Cas to his side. Dean found himself falling asleep, Cas's chest rising and falling alongside his, and the sound of soft wind blowing snow against the window lulled Dean to sleep. Dean woke to find Cas still pressed against him, but something was different now. There was a strange pressure on Dean's leg, and he realized it was Cas's leg, draped over his own. Cas's eyes fluttered open to look at Dean. "Afternoon," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "Afternoon," Dean replied. He found that his own voice was slightly deeper from lack of use as well. "Should we go get something to eat?" Cas asked as he carefully untangled himself from Dean. "Sure, I'm starving," Dean replied. Cas stood up and began putting on his shoes, when suddenly he turned to Dean. "Dean?" Dean looked up from his own shoes. "Yeah, Cas?" "I like our sleeping arrangements." Cas's comment almost made Dean fall off the bed in surprise. He recovered quickly and flashed Cas a smile as he felt something warm wash over his body. He replied in almost a whisper, "Me too." With no more words spoken, they exited their motel room and headed back to the cafe. Dean ordered a burger and fries, and Cas ordered a chicken sandwich. They ate in silence, enjoying their food and occasionally looking into each other's eyes. Once they were done, they left the cafe and re-entered the blizzard. "I can't believe it's still snowing," Cas said quietly. "Wonder how much longer it'll last." "Well, one thing's for sure. It's Christmas Eve. There's no way we're going to make it back to the bunker for Christmas with Sam." Dean nodded. "I know. I'll text Sam once we're back in the room." "What are we going to do now?" Cas asked as they walked. "I have some cards in the Impala if you want to play a game," Dean suggested. "That would be fun," Cas replied. "I'll call Sam while you get the cards." Dean unlocked the Impala and rummaged through the glove compartment to find the deck of cards he knew was stashed there. Upon finding them, he slid out of the Impala and entered their room. Cas was just hanging up from his call with Sam as Dean placed the card deck on the table. "What are we playing?" Cas asked as he situated himself across from Dean. "Spit," Dean said as he began to deal out the cards in an expert-like fashion. It had been a half an hour, and they were still playing the same game of spit. Cas was surprisingly good at the game. His hands always seemed to be on top of piles before Dean could get there. Cas ran out of cards and scooped up the smaller pile, leaving Dean to take the other one, which was teeming with about 20 cards. Cas only had 6 cards left, which meant the game was either nearly over or was about to turn quickly. There was only one spit pile now, and Dean narrowed his eyes as he said, 1, 2, 3, spit. He placed the top card of the deck in his hand on the table and groaned in annoyance. It was a 2. Cas leaped into action, piling his 3 onto the 2 onto the 3, and then a 3 onto the 2, a 4 on the 3, a 5 on the 4, and a 4 back on the 5. He slapped the empty side of the table and grinned up at Dean, who sighed. "I'm glad I could beat you at something," Cas said. "You're like a ninja. I hardly see your hands moving half the time." Cas smirked. "That's payback for all the snowballs." The day dragged on as Dean and Cas played card game after card game. Dean beat Cas at gin and blackjack. Cas beat Dean in Go Fish in another game of spit. The snow was starting to slow down now as night began to fall. Dinner? Dean asked. Cas nodded, and they bundled up and once again trekked to the little cafe. This time, Dean got a steak dinner and a piece of cherry pie. Cas got a salad. Really? Dean huffed when the food arrived. Cas tipped his head in confusion. What? I can't believe you got a salad, Dean replied as he took a bite of his fillet. Cas shrugged as he shoved the green leaves into his mouth. Sam likes it. Yeah, but Sam is Sam. Cas wiped his mouth on his napkin. Dean watched the dressing slip from Cas's lips and spread across the white paper. I just thought I'd give it a try. It's not so bad, actually. Dean finished his steak and turned to his pie. Cas watched Dean eat with a small smile on his lips. What? Dean asked. A piece of pie fell from his mouth as he spoke. Nothing, Cas replied. Dean shrugged and kept eating until there was nothing left. All right, he said as he threw out his pie container and placed the steak plate on top of the trash can. Let's go play another game of spit. I'm going to beat you this time. Cas chuckled. In your dreams. Spit game after spit game they played. Dean still had not won, and it was nearing 11:30 at night. Are you going to give up yet? Cas asked as he picked up the smallest pile and rearranged his cards. Never, Dean growled as he took the bigger pile and started stacking his cards. The next round went quickly, almost too quickly. Dean knew something wasn't right because he was actually winning. As Dean slapped the empty pile, he scowled at Cas. You let me win. Cas looked at Dean, his eyes full of innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Dean narrowed his eyes at Cas before he checked his watch. It's 11:55. We should go to bed. Cas stood up and pushed the curtain on the window aside. It's almost Christmas, Dean. Let's go outside and wait for midnight. It's only lightly snowing now. Dean didn't see any reason to argue, so he followed Cas back out into the cold. Cas leaned up against the Impala, his eyes turned to the sky. As Dean sat there, his arm pressed closely against Cas's, the snow biting his cheeks and catching on his eyelashes, he felt happy. As the minutes ticked by, Dean suddenly felt something slip into his hand. Fingers intertwined with his, and Dean felt his breath hitch in his throat. Dean, Cas said. Yeah, Dean replied, his heart drumming in his chest as he waited for Cas's next words. The alarm went off on Dean's watch, indicating the time to be midnight, Christmas Day. I love you. Before Dean could do anything to stop it, Cas was using his free hand to turn Dean's face towards his and pull him forward so that their lips touched. Dean didn't know what to do. He'd kissed plenty of people before, but they'd all been women. This was different. This was Cas. Dean couldn't deny that there was something about Cas that he'd always been drawn to. Cas said they had a profound bond, whatever that meant. Dean always denied that he was attracted to men, because he was, until he met Cas. The way Cas's blue eyes always seemed to go deeper than just his exterior whenever he stared at Dean, like they were piercing his soul and not his eyes. The heat Dean felt whenever they were in close proximity. That's why Dean had talked to Cas about personal space. He couldn't control himself when Cas was so close. Dean had forced himself to keep every thought of Cas in a romantic way pushed into the far regions of his brain. But now, everything he'd hidden from Sam, from Cas, from himself, was flooding to the surface. He was kissing Cas. Cas's mouth worked well with Dean's as they hungrily drew the kiss deeper. The warmth of Cas's hand on his cheek kept Dean from moving away. He brought his own hands to untangle themselves in Cas's snow-covered hair. As the kiss deepened, Dean realized he didn't want it to end. He didn't want Cas to leave his side ever again. Finally, Cas broke away from Dean, his blue eyes fluttering open, melting the snowflakes that had taken up residence there. Dean felt like his breath had been stolen away as he smiled back at Cas. Regaining his composure, he said, I love you too, Cas. Cas's hand found Dean's again, and he turned back to the sky and rested his head on Dean's shoulder. Merry Christmas, Dean. Dean gave Cas's hand a squeeze as he brought his cheek to rest against the top of Cas's head. Merry Christmas, Cas.